The most expensive thing I ever bought cost me nothing on paper. No receipt. No contract. No bank record that anyone could point to today. Yet at 95 years old, when I wake before dawn and listen to the old radiator clicking in the dark, I still feel the weight of that purchase sitting on my chest. If you're carrying anger towards someone who owes you money, or if you're about to trust someone simply because you've known them for years, stay with me. Before this story ends, you'll understand why some debts can destroy two lives at once, and why the largest loss I ever suffered wasn't the money itself. I know this because I spent 68 years believing I had been betrayed by the one person I trusted more than my own brother. My name is Walter. I am 95 years old. I have lived through wars, recessions, market crashes, and winters cold enough to freeze water pipes solid. I've buried my parents, my wife, and most of the people I once called friends. But one memory followed me longer than all the others. It began with a loan. In the spring of 1964, I handed my best friend $12,000. Today that might not sound extraordinary. Back then, it was nearly everything I had. I counted the bills myself at my kitchen table. The window was open. I remember the smell of fresh cut grass drifting inside. I remember my wife standing quietly at the sink, drying a plate and watching us without saying a word. And I remember my friend smiling. The same smile he had worn when we were boys stealing apples from Mr. Henderson's orchard. The same smile he wore when he stood beside me at my wedding. I trusted that smile more than I trusted the bank. That was my mistake. And for the next 37 years, I believed it ruined my life. After I gave him the money, something in our friendship changed in ways I didn't understand at first. The first month, he still called me brother the way he always had. He said the loan was for a business opportunity, something about machinery, contracts, a factory expansion. I didn't ask too many questions. In 1964, asking too many questions felt like doubting a man's character, and I didn't want to become that kind of person. 2 months later, he stopped coming by my house on Sundays. 3 months later, he stopped answering immediately when I called. There was always a delay, an excuse, a meeting, a trip, a deal that couldn't wait. By the 6th month, I started writing down the dates I last heard his voice. I told myself it was just business stress. I told myself real friendship doesn't vanish over something as small as money. But there is a moment when denial stops sounding like hope and starts sounding like humiliation. For me, it was a Tuesday in November. Cold rain pressed against the kitchen window. I was sitting at the same table where I had counted the money months earlier. My wife asked quietly, "Do you still believe him?" I didn't answer. Because I did. And I didn't. Both at the same time. Then came the first real crack. I went to see him unannounced. His office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown. The stairs smelled like dust and wet coats. I remember counting each step, 27 in total, like it mattered. His secretary said he wasn't available. But I saw his coat hanging behind the door. That was the first time I understood something had shifted. I didn't confront him. I didn't shout. I just left quietly, holding onto the railing longer than I needed to. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark listening to the clock in the hallway tick like it was measuring something I had already lost. And still I didn't stop trusting him. Because admitting I was wrong felt worse than being wrong. The years didn't break the friendship all at once. They erased it slowly, like handwriting washed by rain. Scene 1, 1968, 4 years later. I met him by accident outside a train station. He looked thinner, sharper around the eyes, like someone who had learned to survive on less truth. For a second, I felt relief, real relief, because I still believed we were connected. "Walter," he said, smiling too quickly. "You look good." I wanted to ask about the money. I didn't. Instead, I asked how his business was going. He nodded. "Growing. Just slow." That word slow became the excuse that kept me silent for another decade. He shook my hand longer than necessary, then stepped back like he was already late for a life I wasn't part of. Scene 2, 1975, 11 years after the loan. My daughter was getting married that summer. I remember standing outside the church, adjusting my tie with hands that wouldn't stop shaking for reasons I couldn't explain. He didn't come. No call. No letter. Nothing. That evening, I told myself he must have been busy. But deep down, I understood something had already ended and I was the last one attending its funeral. Scene 3, 1981, 17 years later. I saw his name in a newspaper. A small article. Nothing dramatic. His company had been involved in restructuring. Debt problems. Assets frozen. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the paper until the ink blurred. My wife placed her hand on my shoulder. "You should let it go," she said. But I didn't hear her properly. All I heard was one thought repeating itself louder each year: if I just wait a little longer, he will fix it. And that thought kept me loyal to a man who had already stopped being my friend decades ago. I didn't know it yet, but the waiting itself was the real cost. And it was about to reach its final form. It happened in a hospital, the kind of place where time doesn't move forward, it just repeats itself in softer lighting. I was 76 when I got the call. His name on the other end of the line didn't sound like the man I had known. It sounded smaller. Broken in places I couldn't see. "Walter. I'm in St. Mary's," he said. "They said you were still the only number I had." Only number, that line stayed with me all the way there. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and old paper. A television in the waiting room played a silent morning show nobody was watching. I remember the sound of my shoes on the floor too loud, like I was interrupting something sacred. When I entered his room, I didn't recognize him at first. His face had collapsed into itself. Not just age, something heavier. Exhaustion that had been building for years without permission. He tried to smile. It didn't work. "Walter," he whispered, "you came." I stood at the foot of the bed for a long time. My hands were cold, even though the room was warm. I finally said, "Do you remember the 12,000? Silence. He looked at the ceiling instead of me. "I tried," he said quietly. "I really tried. There were setbacks, things you wouldn't understand." That sentence, "you wouldn't understand," was the same sentence I had repeated to myself for 20 years to keep believing him. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, but completely. I pulled a chair closer. And then I said the words I had rehearsed in my mind for decades. I didn't come for excuses. His breathing changed. Faster. Shallower. "I came because I wanted to know one thing," I said. "Was I ever your friend, or just your safety net?" He turned his head toward me slowly. For the first time, there was no smile. No business talk. No story. Just a man who had nothing left to offer. And then he said something I wasn't ready to hear. "I stopped being your friend the day I took your money." A long silence followed. Only the machine beside his bed kept counting. Beep. 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 I stood up. And I left without saying goodbye. Outside the hospital, the air felt colder than it should have been for that season. I sat on a bench near the entrance for a long time, watching people come and go with papers in their hands, as if life could still be signed and corrected. That's when I finally understood something I had been refusing for decades. We had both paid for that money. He lost his freedom trying to repay what he could never recover. I lost something worse. I lost years thinking I was still waiting for a friend. There is a word I invented later in life for that kind of debt. I called it a ghost loan. Money that leaves your hands but keeps collecting interest in your mind. Not from banks. From memory. For a long time, I believed the lesson was about betrayal. But the truth was simpler, and harder. The moment I handed him that envelope in 1964, I didn't just lend money. I lent him my silence. And that silence grew into something that sat between every phone call, every missed visit, every soon that never came. Years later, I returned to that memory again and again, asking myself if I would do it differently. The answer surprised me. I wouldn't have given less trust. I would have asked for truth earlier. Not promises. Not explanations. Just truth. Because money can be replaced in a lifetime, but the version of friendship built on avoidance cannot survive honesty. And when I think of him now, I don't think of a thief. I think of two old men sitting in different rooms of the same mistake, both too proud to admit where it started breaking. And maybe you're sitting with your own version of that right now. Waiting for someone to fix something they've already stopped repairing. Telling yourself it's still business, still delay, still complicated. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it already ended, and only your waiting is still alive. What are you actually protecting when you refuse to ask the hard question, and who are you becoming while you wait? The bench outside that hospital is still there in my memory. Cold metal. Quiet morning. No answers left. Just the realization that trust isn't what destroys you. Unspoken truth does. I went back to that hospital bench many times after that day, even when there was no reason to go. Not to see him. He was gone within weeks. Not to change anything. There was nothing left to change. I went because I kept thinking about the sound of that monitor in his room. That steady counting. Beep, 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 like time itself had no interest in forgiveness. One winter morning, I sat there again in my old coat. The same one I wore the day I gave him the money in 1964. Funny how clothes survive longer than trust. The bench was wet from melting snow. A nurse walked past me, stopped for a moment, and asked if I needed help finding someone. I almost laughed. Because I had spent my entire life looking for someone who was already gone. Not physically. Emotionally. The disappearance happened years before the hospital ever saw his name on a chart. And yet I kept arriving late to that realization, as if truth needed my permission. When I stand up now, my knees remind me I am still here. Still counting days I don't fully own anymore. But I don't wait for him now. I don't wait for apologies that will never form properly in someone else's mouth. I don't wait for a version of the past that behaves differently if I think about it long enough. I only remember one thing clearly. That morning in 1964, I thought I was handing a friend money. But I was really handing him a test neither of us understood how to pass. And I failed it first. The last time I looked at that hospital building, I said something quietly, not to him, not to anyone who could answer. Just to the air. Trust isn't what I lost. I paused. It's what I finally learned how to see. And then I walked home. Slowly. Like someone who no longer needed to arrive anywhere on time.